Yeah, let's get some life back in here. Amazing. Thank you so much for the panel, guys. Clayton, the AVS ecosystem, AJ, you guys are awesome. Wanted to take some time today to tell you guys about where we want Eigen to move in the right direction and what we're thinking of over the next coming months. So I'm actually going to go off script today a little bit. The slides are kind of a placeholder, but we're going to talk today about where Eigen fits into the global digital coordination game. And I think that's the real focus of what we're trying to build here. So we see blockchains as digital coordination systems, and that's their real value. And so, one of the main points is society's ability to innovate directly mirrors its, its rate of coordination and its ability to coordinate. And you can see that throughout history with, whether it's the Roman Empire and, infrastructure like roads and networks and things like that, or the Greek Empire with the introduction of democracy. And then you ended up with this, primitive of information coordination, which is, telegraphs, radios, media, etc., all the way down to the internet, which really kind of exploded to the digital coordination phase. And so, there is quite a bit of positive, valuable things that digital coordination has brought. Examples of this are open source. Open source has dramatically shifted how we operate. Linux started off as a minimum set of libraries and then became a predefined set of bundles and then eventually grew into, multiple forks and distros and things like that. You have, crowdsourcing solutions. So Kickstarter is a great example of this, where the community can effectively go and incubate innovation. And you can come up with ways for society to coordinate and find interesting projects and go and invest in them, right? But there are a few things that are definitively broken in these systems. These systems can provide misinformation. This was very common in a lot of the social coordination systems that we saw in social media over the last few years. They can also engage in, kind of predatory rent-seeking behaviors. This can be things like, even surge pricing on Uber, where, should that necessarily be a thing that the platform can decide whether it wants to enforce or not? And, it leads to a lot of fragmentation and a lack of innovation. So at Eigen, we're really thinking about what does digital coordination look like, and how do we build systems that can self-govern, meaning those who are part of the ecosystem have a say in how the ecosystem resolves disputes, how the ecosystem handles coordination, whether it's across any dimensions. So right now, the predominant dimension that we look at is financial coordination, which is what Ethereum is focused on, what all blockchains are effectively focused on in terms of cryptocurrencies, and that's a form of financial coordination. But we also have social coordination, like SocialFi or GameFi or social consensus, which is very important to achieving finality on Ethereum or on any L1, as well as physical coordination, right? And these are just one of multiple dimensions, but physical coordination could be things like DPINs, where you have decentralized physical infrastructure networks, and you're able to identify ways to coordinate as a society based on the physical, abilities of whether it's resources. A great example of this is a project coming out of A16Z that's focused on developing proofs of utilities. Essentially, what is the energy capacity of any individual household on the grid? And previously, you would have this information, but it was highly centralized because your utility provider could engage in rent-seeking behaviors. Meaning, I know that somebody has surplus energy capacity, and I don't necessarily have to compensate for them, even if their energy utilization is low. And if their utilization is high, well, then I can charge however I want to. So if we have a self-governing system, then eventually we could have a much more fair usage of resources as we move into tackling problems like global climate change or things like that, we can effectively use physical coordination of energy proofs to be able to identify how do we tackle some of these larger problems at scale. So building these self-governed distributed systems that can effectively provide a higher degree and a higher bar of coordination for society is what Eigen is focused on in terms of a very big picture. And on the way to achieving that as a blockchain community, we have to start thinking from the perspective of what do ecosystems really mean to us, right? I want to say Henri from Starkware yesterday had a really good message that he brought up, which is, before my cousins, my brothers, before my neighbors, my cousins, before my before my countrymen, my neighbors, and so on and so forth. And so today we have a lot of L2s in the Ethereum ecosystem whose role was to offload computation and scale Ethereum. But what's ended up happening is you have a bunch of L2s that are inherently very competitive with each other, and rather than focusing on scaling Ethereum, we're actually trying to fight over the existing set of resources, which is where, whether it's devs, whether it's users, whether it's, liquidity or things like that. Hence why EigenLayer is focused on shared security, because we want to enable a platform for all of these builders to be able to coordinate more effectively. So, rather than, and the reason I brought up that adage is, let's just say, tomorrow we all have so far we're looking at the modular versus monolithic, and we say Solana versus Ethereum, but if Solana was to go through some sort of regulatory pressure, we would all likely unite and say, hey, despite being completely different stacks, we're still part of the overall blockchain ecosystem, and so we need to go out and support our brothers in a different ecosystem because there's a much bigger threat. And so similarly, we need to find ways inside the Ethereum ecosystem for L2s, for infra, for all of these projects to coordinate more effectively so we can actually make a dent in bringing users, bringing use cases, bringing adoption on board. So applications today are predominantly living still on Web 2. And most of us still interact with Web 2 applications that are comprised of many services. Right? You end up using Stripe for your payment, OAuth for your sign-in. It's a very SaaS-based architecture. And the modular thesis is actually just bringing service-based architecture, which existed in Web 2 for many, many years, over to Web 3, which is a far more simpler design mechanism where rather than every project being heavily redundant in the work that's required to bootstrap themselves, right, which, for economic security, EigenLayer is building, you're able to innovate on the specific stack that you specialize in. So, a few years ago, in order to innovate on the consensus layer, you would need to go ahead and bootstrap your whole trust network just so you could innovate on that one specialized factor. But now, you want to be able to enable builders to innovate on these factors without having to do any of the existing redundant work. And why does that matter? Well, we need the value that was being extracted away or moved from the Ethereum ecosystem to other platforms to congregate, coordinate, so we can increase the value of the Ethereum community. And we want Ethereum native development and value distribution. So you want to create, distribute, and then capture the value for applications. And the reality is, crypto brings a lot of positives, whether it's native incentive design, you have user governance, permissionless innovation, which is another part of similar to very open source. However, cloud apps need a lot more than that. They need really high throughput. They need cost basis functionalities. They need unit economics to work out. And the reality is, today most applications in crypto are focused on DeFi, and that's because there's a lot of value embedded in these transactions, but on the contrary, we don't necessarily have the largest user base. And a lot of users in Web 2 still live in the other end of the spectrum, which is gaming, social, consumer apps, which have a much higher demand for throughput, but maybe not nearly as high of a demand for security because the embedded value per bit in the transactions or the call data is not nearly as high. And so you end up with this like dichotomy of needing to balance both security and speed or agility. This is like the agility versus stability trade-off. And I heard Clayton mention this in the last panel, but one of the benefits to Clayton and Chunda, actually, one of the benefits to EigenLayer shared security is that the AVSs can all kind of have this shared amount of pool that they can utilize, which dramatically brings down the cost basis for everyone. And so we really want to focus on how can we scale Ethereum by improving the experience for builders, which as a result should drive adoption for users. The only problem with all this is that we're not meeting users where they're at. We're expecting users to come and conform to our user experiences, which inherently aren't as good or require a lot more work for us to get to the point where we can make a zero switching cost impact on the experience that end users or consumers experience. If we're optimizing for traders, if we're optimizing for DeFi, that's a completely different experience than optimizing for social. And so as an infrastructure provider, we want to enable a very low cost basis so devs don't have to pay to tinker. Right? That's one of the worst experiences for devs because it's a highly demotivating process of needing to spend money in order to just innovate. So EigenLayer, we want to unleash the cloud era of crypto. And what does that mean? So we have a plethora of services that are being built on the EigenLayer shared security, which include EigenDA, which is an internal service, EigenCert, which is an upcoming internal service, potentially that will solve some problems for us. But we also have a lot of external teams building in the AVS ecosystem that provide a lot of unique value props to rollups. An example is Espresso, as mentioned by Verity earlier, when it comes to consensus and more unique ordering mechanisms. Another example is Witness Chain, who's tackling watchtower networks that can essentially monitor an ecosystem, monitor a rollup, and trigger fraud proofs in an automated platform without necessarily having to have somebody who's constantly, a human who needs to watch. And then beyond that, we have a lot more interesting innovation happening when it comes to the AVS ecosystem, where we're trying to experiment with bringing different VMs, different cryptography methods, whether it's fully homomorphic encryption, trusted execution environments, secure multi-party computation, as well as cryptographic primitives like proofs that can really expand the use cases that these applications need to deploy. And what has ended up happening as a result is we have this robust, diverse ecosystem of plenty of AVSs that are live, that are active, that have economic security, and are being supported by the Ethereum network, and are in the process of being able to validate using the Ethereum staker and operator set, as well as rely on the Ethereum community for economic security, as well as devs and users. And one of the goals that we want to have happen is increase the ability for app-specific rollups to be able to deploy much faster, right? App-specific rollups have a lot of unique properties to make them far more competitive with L1s than they are today. Right now, L1s seem to outrun these app-specific rollups, but using EigenDA, we can come up with ways where, with experimentation on the VM layer, with gasless transactions, with the sequencer being able to provide instant confirmations, composability, existing liquidity, the Ethereum ecosystem is naturally poised for the next incubation of all these app-specific rollups. And so how can we do that is by, again, creating cost mechanisms and removing the throughput barriers or building barriers, right? We've reached a place of repetitive feedback loops of limited block space constraints, which is kind of inherently reduce the creativity of what's possible for blockchain developers. But we need to get to a point where we kind of break that mold for them and reignite their passion to be able to build whatever they want if block space was no longer a constraint. The other factor outside of cost is, I'm going to skip through here real quick, is actually you want to provide unique value properties to the rollups native token. And with EigenDA, the rollups native token can pay for DA fees, can drive value back to the Ethereum stakers and operators, and also help them provide a lot more unique properties with the dual staking models. So by enabling these rollups to outrun L1s eventually, we can start incubating and start bringing far more consumer use cases into the ecosystem. So EigenLayer brings all these new features to rollups because of our diverse AVS ecosystem, and we wouldn't be able to do it without them because, you know, we can only build certain applications like EigenDA, for example, that removes the throughput barrier, but without oracles, without fully homomorphic encryption, without the VM innovation where projects like Cartesi are bringing Linux to Ethereum, there's already an existing plethora of Linux applications, but the reality is, and the reality is there's plenty of users there, but there hasn't been a way for them to be able to bridge to the Ethereum community thus far. And so how can we use our AVSs to be able to kind of eliminate these disadvantages and turn these rollups into a far more competitive player in the landscape of L2s, L1s? So at the end of the day, we want to unleash the cloud era of crypto for blockchains by enabling projects to remove redundancies of bloat that needs to get built in their life cycle and have them focus on innovating in the dimensions that they're focused in, whether that's across the existing set of AVSs that I just described, or there's complete new innovation of a completely different paradigm that people want to bring in. An example of that is something that we've been working on, like Eigen Insurance. The best explainer would be Shriram's talk at SBC last year on StakeSure, so I highly recommend everyone going and checking that out. But prior to the shared security and slashing context, we were not able to build a protocol like this. But if we can start creating more unique opportunities, then we can actually make a dent in the consumer adoption of Ethereum. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much.